Let's talk about pensions. At their heart, they're a promise, right? A promise of security when you're older. But what happens when those promises get, well, a little too big to keep? Today, we're diving into this hidden tension that exists inside pretty much every pension system in the world. It's a huge challenge, and it affects millions of lives and even the stability of entire countries.
I love this quote from our source material because it just hits the nail on the head. It's this idea of making these massive financial promises for the future. We're talking decades down the line, without always having a rock-solid plan for how you're actually going to pay for it all.
So there's a name for this gap. It's called fiscal pension debt. And it sounds kind of technical, but the concept is really simple. It's just the difference between what the government has promised and the money it realistically expects to have. But this isn't just some abstract number, not at all. It's a real burden that more often than not gets passed down to the next generation to deal with.
Now, this is not some brand new problem that just popped up. To really get it, we need to zoom out and look at the global picture. This pension squeeze has been putting pressure on wealthy, advanced economies for decades, and it really all boils down to a massive shift in how our societies are structured.
And this right here shows you that shift perfectly. See, these systems were designed back when you had a whole bunch of young workers paying in, and they were supporting a much smaller group of retirees. The math worked. But that pyramid, it's basically been flipped upside down. We're all living longer, which is great, but we're also having fewer kids. So now you have way fewer workers trying to support a much, much larger group of retirees.
And the financial impact of this is just staggering. I mean, take a look at these projections. For countries like France and Italy, you're seeing pension spending that's expected to be more than 10% of their entire GDP, their whole economic output. That is a massive, very real strain on a country's budget.
Okay, so countries haven't just been sitting around doing nothing. They've tried to react, right? They've raised retirement ages, they've tinkered with the benefit formulas. Some, like Sweden, have even brought in these notional accounts that try to link your benefits more closely to what you paid in. But, and this is the key thing to understand, these have mostly been patches. They've helped contain the problem, maybe, but they haven't solved that underlying deficit. The debt is still there, lurking in the background.
So to see how all these pressures are playing out right now, in the real world, let's zoom in on a modern case study, Chile. The country is in the middle of debating a new pension reform, but it is running headfirst into its own version of this global challenge, and it really shows just how tricky it is to get this right.
This chart really shows you the system's biggest vulnerability. A pension system needs one thing above all else: people consistently paying into it. But in Chile, look at this. Only about 40% of the workforce are regular contributors. When you have so many people working informally or out of work, the whole system is resting on a really narrow, unstable foundation.
And that leads to this huge mismatch. The source material points out that the reform plan on the table is really designed for the minority, about 30% of the population, who have those stable, formal jobs. The plan itself just doesn't line up with the reality of how most people in the country actually earn a living.
So what's the consequence? When most people can't consistently pay in, someone has to pick up the slack. And as this slide says, the inevitable outcome is that the state has to step in and cover a huge chunk of future pension payments. And what does that do? It massively increases that fiscal pension debt we were just talking about.
This whole situation might be starting to sound a little familiar. This is the point where we connect Chile's current struggle back to that bigger global story, and it forces us to ask a pretty tough question about the road they're heading down.
I mean, you can almost map it out. This is the classic path that so many developed countries have walked. First, with the best intentions, you expand social benefits. Then, demographics catch up with you, the population gets older, and the system's finances get stretched thinner and thinner. And finally, you pass these partial reforms that plug a few holes but don't actually fix the leak.
Which brings us right to this really provocative question, which is kind of the core of our whole explainer today. Is Chile just running the same playbook? The source suggests that, yeah, they might be. But with one absolutely critical difference. They're doing it with a more fragile economy and a lot less room for error. The stakes are even higher.
So if that's the trap, how do you avoid it? How do you build a system that's not just fair for today's retirees, but is actually financially sustainable for the long run? The answer isn't about quick fixes. It's about building a much stronger foundation from the ground up.
And this is what that stronger foundation could look like. The source suggests it's not about finding one magic solution. It's a multi-pronged attack. You have to encourage individual savings so people have their own safety net. You've got to tackle that informal labor market to bring more people into the system and widen that base.
And, this is a big one, you have to lock in strict fiscal rules to stop that debt from spiraling out of control.
And we'll end with this thought, which really sums it all up. The political temptation is always to provide bread for today, Solve the immediate problem, make people happy right now. But without deep, honest, realistic reforms that fix the underlying problems, you're just setting things up for the cash box to be empty again tomorrow. At the end of the day, a pension is a promise between generations. And maybe the greatest challenge of our time is figuring out how to make promises that we can truly actually afford to keep.